Today's episode of Hidden Forces is made possible by listeners like you. For more information about this week's episode or for easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. And remember, if you listen to the show on your Apple Podcast app, you can give us a review. Each review helps more people find the show and join our amazing community. And with that, please enjoy this week's episode. In 1609, while in search of a rumored northeast passage to Asia, the English explorer and navigator Henry Hudson landed on what is modern-day New York City. Though written accounts exist of Hudson's encounters with local tribes, native accounts have been handed down to us through oral tradition, often transcribed much later by missionaries and settlers. In 1765, a Moravian missionary who lived for many years among the Delaware and Mohican tribes recorded a native account of the first meeting. Some Indians who had been out fishing where the sea widens spied at a great distance something remarkably large, swimming or floating on the water. It was agreed among those who were spectators that as this phenomenon moved towards the land, it would be well to inform all the Indians on the inhabited islands. Chiefs from scattered tribes who arrived in numbers concluded the strange appearance to be a large canoe or house in which the great Supreme Being himself was coming to visit them. Such descriptions by native peoples of their first encounters with white settlers were common throughout the Americas. The first man to bring news to the great Aztec king Montezuma of Spanish ships described what he saw from the Gulf Coast as, quote, towers or small mountains floating on the waves of the sea. In other accounts, natives looked from the shore and thought the awesome, approaching ships were giant white seabirds or floating islands. There are even theories that the Arawak, the first tribe to encounter Columbus's ships off the coast of Hispaniola, could, for a time, see only their ripples across the horizon, unable to picture what was for them unprecedented, unimagined, alien. What all these people had in common was that they were unable to name, let alone recognize, a force of creative destruction so vast and boundless that it would make their worlds unrecognizable, their homes uninhabitable, their lives unlivable. They were unable to see the ships and their crew for what they were, the vessels of conquerors, pillagers and looters of unsullied lands. Unable to name them, they welcomed them, agents of their own annihilation. This week on Hidden Forces, Shoshana Zuboff, Digital Natives, the Unprecedented, and Finding Home in the Age of Surveillance Capitalism. So, Dr. Zuboff, I was just telling you before we turn on the microphones how much I valued reading your book. What was your objective in writing it, and why the name Surveillance Capitalism?
I think the larger project here, and the reason why I call this new market form surveillance capitalism, is that its mechanisms are designed to be hidden. That it's a backstage operation. Its mechanisms are designed to keep us in ignorance. And the result of that is that even though it's something unprecedented, it's very hard for us to detect it in our midst. And so my aim has been to unveil piece by piece the actual mechanisms, what it is, how it works, why it strives to remain hidden and secret, why our ignorance is its bliss, if you will.
You also talk about this concept of radical indifference in the context of what you call instrumentarianism, which is to surveillance capitalism what totalitarianism was to industrial capitalism. How does that fit in?
Well, a lot of people have, in the sense of unease that we have with the direction that the digital has taken under surveillance capitalism. People know that, we're being monitored and we're being tracked, and, there's a lot of reference to Big Brother and a lot of reference to concepts like digital totalitarianism. And I thought it was important to really ask the question, what is the kind of power that surveillance capitalism produces? Because really, it's not a totalitarian power. Totalitarianism is a form of power based on, first of all, terror, murder. Totalitarianism aimed to control individuals from the inside out. It wanted you to believe what it wanted you to believe, and it wanted to control your thoughts and your feelings and your emotions, and it wanted you to conform to everything that it held as ideologically correct and necessary, and it was willing to murder you on the way to that conformity and, purging the human species for the sake of this kind of perfection inside and out. The kind of power that's created by surveillance capitalism is really very, very different. What I found interesting is that when totalitarian burst upon the world in the 1930s and 40s, it was also an unprecedented form of power. People couldn't recognize it in their midst because it was so unprecedented, so bizarre. Its demands and claims were so unimaginable and intolerable that really people couldn't get their arms around it or believe that it was even real until the evidence of the murder and the terror and the gulags and the concentration camps and so forth. Well, the kind of power that's created by surveillance capitalism is equally unprecedented, but not with the same kind of violence. It's a much more subtle and abstract kind of violence. But because of its unprecedented nature, it has also been very challenging to perceive, to name, to grasp, to understand, to predict. And so this has been a big part of my work, to try and fill in those blanks. The nature of instrumentarian power, since you bring up radical indifference, is that it's a power that is used to really shape, tune, herd the behavior of individuals and populations toward the kinds of commercial outcomes that surveillance capitalists and their business customers seek. And it uses the instrumentation of the ubiquitous digital architecture that now surrounds us in our daily lives. It uses that instrumentation as the means to a sort of global capability for behavioral modification that can push us and herd us and shunt us in the direction that it wants us to go for the sake of its commercial outcomes. But the thing is here that it doesn't care what we do. It doesn't care what we believe. It doesn't care what we feel. It doesn't care if we are in great pain. It doesn't care if we are experiencing great joy. All it cares about is that whatever we are doing, whatever we are thinking, whatever forms of action we are taking, that we are doing those things in ways that it can capture the behavioral data from those activities, translate those behavioral data into predictions, sell those predictions into new markets that trade exclusively in behavioral futures, in predictions of what we will do now, soon, and later, sell those to its business customers who have a vested interest in knowing our future behavior. So this is a completely different direction where our behavior becomes simply instrumentalized on the way to achieving commercial outcomes for business customers interested in the future of our behavior. And this is the essence of instrumentarian power. And I call this radical indifference because instrumentarian power's attitude toward us, its point of view, if you will, is a point of view where it really doesn't care about us. It just cares that it has access to the data that leaches from our activities, that it can use for its predictions. And the result of that is what I call radical indifference. There was a memo that was produced by a Facebook executive named Andy Bosworth that was released accidentally at some point just a little over a year or two ago, where he was actually coaching his team on what I would call the operations of radical indifference. And the way he put it was, the economic imperative for Facebook is growth. Growth comes from connection. And I'm paraphrasing, of course, because I'm not reading this memo right now. But essentially he said, look, if people connect on Facebook and they use that connection to create a terrorist plot and people get killed, we continue to connect because connection is growth, and that's our life. If people use connection on Facebook to fall in love and get married and live happily ever after, we continue to connect because connection is growth, and growth is our imperative. So here he's illustrating the point of view of radical indifference. It may lead to terror and death. It may lead to love and happiness. We can't care about that. We don't care about the content of behavior, the content of connection, the content of what happens on our platform. All we care about is the fact of connection, that we get the data from all of that connection, because that's the data that drives economic growth for Facebook as a premier surveillance capitalist. So Bosworth was acting as a very responsible, accountable, excellent surveillance capitalist, and beautifully illustrating the point of view of surveillance capitalism, which is radical indifference.
This is something I was wondering about when I was reading your book. The aim, as you state here, is to obtain this data and to compute it in order to make more accurate predictions. The more accurate predictions, the more profitable the enterprise. Aren't the most accurate predictions, if you were to follow this logic to its final destination, the most accurate predictions are those which you have a hand in formulating? In other words, if you were to herd this hive, you've described it as a hive, if you were directing the behavior of the automata that are in the system, then you can perfectly predict in the final iteration their behavior. Isn't that the sort of the final state of the system? A perfectly controlled, automated system?
All right, so I think it might help a little bit if I gave a quick definition of surveillance capitalism and just very quickly the architecture of its economic imperatives, and then come back to this question because it's kind of the apotheosis of the economic imperatives. Is that all right?
Yeah, and I've been told you don't forget, which is actually great because I would forget. Yes.
I don't forget. So I would define surveillance capitalism this way for our listeners. There are many respects in which surveillance capitalism diverges from the history of market capitalism. But in this one respect that's essential to its definition, it follows in the pattern of how capitalism has evolved over the centuries. And historians have described this process as capitalism continuously claims things that live outside of the market dynamic and it drags them into the market dynamic, converts them into commodities that can be sold and purchased. So famously, industrial capitalism claimed nature. Nature lives in its own time and space. The meadows, the waters, the oceans, the forests lives in its own time and space. But industrial capitalism claimed nature for the industrial dynamic, to have it reborn as real estate, as land, as water that could be sold and purchased in a commodity fashion. And at the time that that happened, that was a radical breakthrough in the whole structure of life. Also, industrial capitalism took the idea of work, which was something that people did in their homes, in their gardens, in their fields, in their cottages. And it brought that into the market dynamic to be reborn as labor that could be sold and purchased in the marketplace. Surveillance capitalism does something similar, but now with a kind of dark twist. And what it does is it claims private human experience as a source of free raw material which is translated into behavioral data. Those data then combined with advanced computational capabilities, the dark satanic mills, if you will, of surveillance capitalism, what we call machine learning, machine intelligence, artificial intelligence, combined with these computational capabilities in order to produce predictions of our future behavior. This began in the context of online targeted advertising. And the specific behavior that they wanted to predict was whether or not we would click through a particular ad. Well, that's a piece of human behavior, clicking. Maybe trivial in the larger scheme of things, online clicking, but their aim was to predict that bit of behavior. And those online targeted ad markets, if you just zoom out a little bit, those were markets where people were trading in these behavioral futures. Who's going to click on my ad? If I put my ad where they tell me to, will I get the click-through rates? So they're betting on future human behavior. And this became the essence, the mechanisms of the economic logic that is surveillance capitalism. Begun at Google, migrated to Facebook, became the default option in Silicon Valley, and is now migrating across many sectors of our economy, many different industries.
Well, you have a starting point that you identify in the book, which is, I think, 2001, thereabouts, what you describe as a sort of crisis in Silicon Valley after the bursting of the bubble, and Google needed to find a business model that could make their company profitable. And this was born out of Google and then has spread and become a logic, an economic logic, as you describe it, for the rest of the economy.
That's right. So it now has a life of its own, and it should not be confused with either one company like Google or two companies like Google and Facebook. It's in the insurance industry, it's in the retail industry, it's in the healthcare industry, it's now in the automotive industry. It's a kind of virus that is spreading through these different sectors and transforming each sector as it moves through. And early on, the competitive dynamic in this new logic is around the quality of prediction. So what's going to come out of that black box of this computational machinery that tells us what people are going to do now, soon, and later? And early on, the competition for predictions began to delineate a new kind of economic imperative. And there were several of these economic imperatives. And the first, of course, was scale, that you needed a lot of behavioral data in order to make powerful predictions. So you need volume of these behavioral data flows. But again, as competition heated up, pretty soon volume was not enough. And now it also became variation. So you need both scale and scope. You need a lot of behavioral data, but you need different kinds of behavioral data. So now we're going to get you offline. I'm going to give you a mobile phone.
Android.
give you an Android at the least possible cost so that there is no friction presented to the continuous flow of behavioral data. So that Android has to be understood as simply a supply chain interface for behavioral data. And it was debated within Google. Some people said, gee, now we have a way of competing with Apple and with the iPhone, and we can make money on our devices and have margins on our devices, and we don't have to make all our money on data. But other people said, no, 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 because we have discovered this powerful logic that is just driving unbelievable volumes of revenue growth. And so what we want to do is lower every single barrier to the flow of behavioral data. So the voices that won in this debate were the voices that said, hey, if we could give Android away for free, let's do that. Because all it is a supply chain interface for behavioral data that goes with you wherever you are in the world, your voice, your camera, your contacts, all the stuff on your phone, but also your location, where you're going, who you're going with, what you're doing, what restaurant you're entering, and so on and so forth. Ultimately, your face, your voice, all these other ways of getting depth, insight into you from the more emotional, personality-related characteristics of yourself. So now we have economies of scale and economies of scope. But prediction competition continues. More people coming on stream, more people searching for these behavioral data, more people trying to get a dominant position in these new prediction markets. So the next horizon, as it were, becomes something that really is new under the sun. Economies of scale, economies of scope. This next one I call economies of action. And the idea here, as you so rightly anticipated, is that the very best predictive data comes from actually intervening in the state of play and finding ways to use, as we said before, the digital surround, all the instrumentation in the digital milieu, what people talk about as ubiquitous computing, to use all of this instrumentation to usually, gently, nudge, coax, tune, herd, subliminally shape and modify your behavior in the direction that we want you to go to fulfill our commercial goals and the commercial goals of our customers in these behavioral futures markets. So the very most powerful means of predicting is to actually be shaping your behavior. And this is when the digital architecture that now pervades our lives, our daily lives, has been repurposed as a global means of behavioral modification. And this has resurrected an old paradigm of behavioral modification that really our societies rejected in the 1960s and the 1970s, when the great leaders of behavioral modification, like the scientist, my former professor at Harvard, B.F. Skinner, considered the father of radical behaviorism.
Well, this is the incarnation of that, the economic incarnation.
This is the economic incarnation of that now on the scale of whole populations.
There's a great quote of B.F. Skinner's. I don't know if I got it from your book, but it resonated with me. It is not a matter of bringing the world into the laboratory, but of extending the practices of an experimental science to the world at large.
Yes, I do cite that in the book. And that is exactly the reversal that we've been through here, where in the 60s and 70s, behavioral modification was being applied to captive audiences in prisons and hospitals and schools. And there was a wide congressional Senate inquiry. The American people were up in arms rejecting these practices. An auspicious group of senators that formed this committee included Edward Kennedy and Sam Erwin and some very famous senators, came down on this and finally concluded that behavioral modification was an affront to the ideal of the autonomous individual, which was essential for democracy, and an affront to democratic society itself. And they forbade any kind of federal funding to go to any kind of program that used behavioral modification on its populations. Now, we fast forward a few decades later, and here we have, under the auspices of private capital, private surveillance capital, the entire digital infrastructure for which, as we began our conversation about home, for which most of us harbored so much hope for an empowered and democratic future. This entire digital architecture now is being hijacked by a new form of capitalism, a mutation of capitalism, a rogue capitalism that uses the digital now as a global means of behavioral modification for the narrow commercial ends of others, not us. Business customers, not the people whose behavior and experience is at stake. Our problems are not being solved. Our problems are simply being instrumentalized for the sake of others' commercial gain.
A lot of things have come to my mind as I'm listening to you talk. One of them has to do with Skinner's black box, and that these algorithms are a black box. And that relates to something you've written in the book, which is that these companies demand to know everything about us, and we can know nothing about them. It's an interesting sort of play on words. There's this imagery that keeps coming to my mind. It isn't exactly a spider's web. And again, there's this surreal quality to what comes across from your writing or from the implications of your writing. Maybe there's a lot of imagination that's left to the reader. And so maybe it is my own imagination, but there's this dark, nightmarish quality of a spider's web where almost like a deer drinking from a river, and it gets tangled up in it. And it feels like we're getting tangled up in this web. And that comes up a lot when you talk. That's something that I think often about. Do you feel that way at all? Does it feel like we're sort of getting entangled, enmeshed in this architecture that is being driven by this economic logic of surveillance capitalism?
It's very interesting the way you bring this up, because as I've been going around talking to groups of people on this subject, I'm finding the same kind of pattern over and over again, where people talk about a sense of anxiety, an unease, a loss of control, a feeling of manipulation, concerns about freedom, concerns about sovereignty, a sense that they need to resist, but not really having a clear grasp of what to resist or how or whom. And so it's this kind of foggy, amorphous, cloudy thing that is closing in around us, that's making us feel anxious and uneasy, like things are not okay. More and more we feel like we have to hide from it. But how to hide? Where to hide? And the response that I'm getting with the work on surveillance capitalism is that here finally we have a way of naming this thing that we're entangled in. And just in the idea of naming, being able to see it clearly, being able to discern its mechanisms, being able to perceive the logic, see how it operates, see how it functions, even though it doesn't change it immediately, it completely changes the experience of it. Because once we can name it and once we have language about it, we start to be empowered. And we start to be able to see where it ends and where we begin. And we start to be able to imagine a space in which there can be resistance and where there can be combat. And we can come together and talk and name and develop our bonds of collective action that can, reinstate some kind of form of combat that we have been robbed of precisely because these mechanisms, look, so much capital has been devoted to ensuring that these mechanisms are invisible. so much skill has been devoted to making sure that the rhetoric in this space of surveillance capitalism is misleading.
And cloaked in inevitability.
And rendered as though it was an inevitable consequence of digital technology.
Right.
So it's laden with euphemism, with the rhetoric of emancipation, with very artfully employed misdirection, telling us it's one thing when it's really another thing. Masses of engineering, skill, and capital devoted to making sure that these mechanisms operate in a way that consistently, comprehensively bypasses individual awareness, so that our ignorance is engineered by these vast accumulations of capital and skill that are now trained on our experience. So out of all of that, we have been robbed of the right to combat. We have been robbed of our decision rights. We have been robbed of a choice to participate or not. And indeed, every single piece of research going back to the early 2000s shows that when people are informed of the nature of these backstage operations, they want nothing to do with them. They do not want to be entangled. They want to be protected. But more and more, as surveillance capital has come to own and operate almost all of the spaces of the internet, there is no place to go. There is no place to escape. The alternatives have been foreclosed, and therefore our means of social participation, just the basic kinds of things we need to do every day, whether it's getting our health data from our physician or getting our grades from our children's teachers or making arrangements with our friends and family for dinner, just the basics of social participation force us to march through the same channels that are surveillance capitalism supply chains. So social participation and surveillance capitalism are increasingly conflated, and the alternatives are foreclosed, and therefore we feel resigned and we feel helpless and racing around all of this, as you've already hinted at, is a larger category error that has been imposed on us, and that's the idea that this is the only way that digital can be.
I think that's a powerful idea, though.
Yeah.
I think that's something that the more I meditated on that, it grew in importance. This point that we're made to believe that what we encounter today is technology. It isn't surveillance capitalism.
It's not economics. It's technology.
And that's the wolf in sheep's clothing. That's the puppeteer behind the puppet. The puppet is the technology. The puppeteer are the surveillance capitalists.
That's right. The puppet is this whole milieu of digital instrumentation.
That doesn't have to be governed by this type of logic.
That can be anything we want it to be.
Right.
And it was, Dimitri, it was.
I agree. I mean, I remember what the 1990s was like.
That's right.
It was nothing like this.
There was a window before surveillance capitalism broke upon the public imagination, when Google was finally IPO'd in 2004, and we got a chance to see the incredible revenues that flowed from this economic logic in just a few short years. Between 2000 and 2004, Google's revenue line increased by 3,590%.
That's a remarkable number.
That's just astonishing, and that was on the back of this economic logic. But look, in the year 2000, a group of really smart designers and engineers and data scientists at Georgia Tech published a really interesting big report on what they called the aware home. And that's what today we think of as the smart home. Mm-hmm. And the aware home was going to do all the things that we want a smart home to do today. It was going to, give us data to make our homes more efficient, and data about our behavior that could help us with our health and our fitness and so on and so forth. Anyway, when they got down to the schematics for the aware home, the schematics were pretty simple. It was a closed loop. Mm-hmm. And it was the devices built into the home itself was one node, and the other node was the occupant of the home. Mm-hmm. And the occupant or the occupants, those are the only people who receive the data. And they decided if it would be shared or not. And they decided how to make sense of it. They decided what to do with it. It was a simple, closed loop that was empowering. Similarly, in the telemedicine field, telemedicine in the year 2000, 2001, 2002, same goals that we have today. But conceived as a simple closed loop, the physician, a server typically located in a hospital, and the patient at home in her or his bed or bedroom or living room or wherever, a simple closed loop where it was the person who received the data, the person who had the decision rights over those data. Just a couple of years ago, 2017, a couple of scholars at the University of London did an analysis of the Nest thermostat. As you know, Nest owned by Google. And they concluded that for a moderately vigilant consumer to install one Nest thermostat in the home requires that person to review a minimum of 1,000 privacy policies and user contracts and user agreements, because the thermostat, of course, is collecting all kinds of behavioral data. It also becomes a hub for other smart devices in the home that are feeding it with behavioral data. Could be your mattress, could be your dishwasher, could be your television set, could be your stereo system. And then all these data are not only going to Nest, but they're going to Nest third parties. And Nest takes no accountability for what the third parties do. Each third party shunts the data to third parties, and they take no accountability. And those third parties and their third parties and so on and so forth in an infinite regress. And then, of course, it turns out that if you don't agree to these thousands of contracts, you slowly lose the functionality of the product. And Nest warns, maybe the smoke alarm won't work. Maybe you end up with frozen pipes. So the very reason that you bought the thermostat in the first place is obviated, is deleted, because the real point of the thermostat is as a supply chain interface for behavioral data, not to serve your needs in your home, for you, for your family, for your energy costs, for your health, everything else that you had hoped for. So this is where we now have, smart products means that we're no longer really working on the product. We're simply using the product as a supply chain interface. Personalized services, we're no longer working on the service to really help you and solve problems in your life. The service is a supply chain interface for behavioral data. And that's the direction that surveillance capitalism is taking our economy.
A phrase that has become popular recently is that you're not the customer, you're the product. But you make the point that you're not really the product, you're actually the resource to be extracted.
Yes.
And what's interesting about this is that now we're getting to a point where not only are we the resource to be extracted, as you say, we're the data that leaches from our sorrow, but we are now to be increasingly guided. It's a two-way mechanism.
It's monitoring and actuation. That's what the data scientists call it. The first phase is monitoring. We can know everything through the digital surround. We can know everything. But then the data scientists describe a later phase called actuation, where we can actually use the same devices that let us know everything. We use that knowledge to now actuate real action, real behavior in the real world of people and things.
It's an interesting is not the right word. I'm trying not to be alarmist because your book's not alarmist. Like I said, it is an intimate read, and it actually has a very, I don't even want to use the word positive message because that also sounds fake. It is positive. It feels genuinely positive. But many of us have been in situations where there have been people in our lives who are somewhat manipulative. They can manipulate us a little bit. And there's an experience of being around someone like that or in a relationship with someone like that where things don't feel right. Something feels off. There is this unease. There's this anxiety. I find this to be very relatable to where we are today.
Yes.
And I feel that this is a shift where we went from this period where the entire attention was focused towards harvesting data to now where increasingly that data is being put to use in actuation. And you've, of course, used one great example, well, a few actually, two I really liked, three maybe, two with Facebook, one with the voting, and the other more pernicious with the happiness and
the emotional
sadness,
contagion.
the emotional contagion, and then the other, it more disturbing in the context of instrumentarianism, the case of Pokemon Go.
Yes.
So maybe you can also tell our listeners who aren't familiar with these case studies what they are, because I think they're significant for where we're going in this discussion.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Well, both of Facebook conducted two what they called massive scale contagion experiments. One was to see if they could affect real-world voting behavior. And in this case, it wasn't telling you to vote for, but just getting you to go vote. So it was like a pre-Cambridge Analytica run-through on this kind of thing. And their second massive-scale contagion experiment was around seeing if they could actually change the emotional valence of a person, make you happier or make you sadder. And the whole idea here was, could we use subliminal cues in the online environment to affect changes in your real life, in the real world? In one case, getting more people to go vote than would have voted without these subliminal cues. And the other case, making some people happier and making other people sadder. And when they went to write up these experiments in the scholarly journals, reputable, very reputable scholarly journals that publish these studies, the researchers, both from Facebook and from academia, boasted that not only, one, had they discovered that you could unloose an emotional contagion through the online milieu that would change real life in the real world, but two, that you could do that by continuously and comprehensively bypassing individual awareness, that people never could see it coming. They never knew it was happening.
That's the thing that's so scary, and that's what I feel like we feel in a subconscious way when we discuss this unease and this anxiety.
Yes, that's right. That's absolutely right.
This feeling of being manipulated without our knowing.
That's right. And it's right that we feel unease because it is happening. I mean, people who are on Facebook, the news feed is like a version of this all the time because the news feed is a complex algorithm. That news feed is constantly being manipulated in order to engender the maximum engagement from you on the site. So this is all an exercise in this kind of manipulation, but some of it, like these massive scale experiments, begin to show us a sense of its ambitions, not only toward just collecting our data online, but toward society itself, toward how surveillance capitalism moves toward the real world, toward organizing real populations as we move through our real lives in our cities, in our countries, in our societies, to tune and herd and coax us in the real world toward its guaranteed outcomes. And that's where Pokemon Go comes in. Pokemon Go, as you know, was an augmented reality game developed and incubated at Google, spun off at the last minute for its introduction to the world. But Pokemon Go really was a population-level experiment in how we use now this digital architecture to herd populations through the real places in our real cities toward the guaranteed outcomes that our business customers want. In the case of Pokemon Go, which was nominally owned by a company called Niantic Labs, which also came out of Google, run by John Hanke, who was behind Street View. Before that, he was behind Google Earth. Before that, he invented the satellite system that was invested in by the CIA that then was bought by Google that became Google Earth.
That's an important piece also, just to throw it in there.
Exactly.
The surveillance state component and how important 9/11 was and the terrorist attacks were to enabling this, not just on the regulatory front, but also for the culture to get to this place where people say, I don't have nothing to hide, why do I care?
Right. That's a key piece of this. The interests of the surveillance state were critical to incubating and nurturing and these fledgling companies with their really cool, amazing new surveillance capabilities that bypassed awareness and so forth, and making sure that there was very little, if any, law that impeded their growth and their development, so that these capabilities would be there when the state needed to dip in, because these capabilities were allowed to grow and flourish under the auspices of private capital, free from constitutional constraints, free from other kinds of democratic law that ultimately even our intelligence agencies are accountable to. So in the case of Pokemon Go, what we saw was that at first it seemed like, how is Pokemon Go making money? Well, it's making money because people buy doodads for their Pokemon creatures, and they buy banners and they tokens to get them up to
Digital
the next level of
wares.
the game, and these various accessories that enhance the game. But ultimately, what became clear was that Pokemon Go, Niantic Labs, had convened its own behavioral futures markets. So it had establishments in the city, the pizza joints, the restaurants, the bars, the McDonald's franchises, the other kinds of services, places where they might, fix your car, or where you might want to go shopping. All these places were paying Niantic Labs for guaranteed footfall. So now, again, you see the exact same structure as what we talked about before in the online targeted advertising. Online targeted advertising, we're paying for a piece of future behavior, which is a click-through. Now we're in the real world, on the real streets, in the city, in the parks, in and out of homes, in and out of cars. We're paying for a piece of future behavior. This time it's not click-through, it's footfall. It's your real body in a real place, spending real money in my restaurant, in my shop, whatever it might be. So now we have come kind of full circle now to how we learn to herd populations through the real places of our real lives toward others' guaranteed commercial outcomes, all of it outside of our awareness, while we think that we're just playing Pokemon Go. And this, of course, is a rehearsal. It's a dry run for the model of the smart city, which Google calls the Google City. It's what citizens in Toronto are contesting this very day, as the public officials of Toronto have ceded to Google a part of the waterfront to develop. And Eric Schmidt, when he heard about this great coup that they had landed, said, now it's our turn. Our turn means that if it's our turn, it's private capital's turn, it's surveillance capital's turn to run the city, instead of what? Instead of democracy's turn, instead of the citizens' turn. Means that democracy's turn is up, and now it's surveillance capitalism's turn to run the city, to replace politics with computation, to replace citizens with statistics, to replace the city with the idea of a population. This is where we begin to see the economic imperatives driving an economic logic inexorably offline into the real world, beyond scale, beyond scope, into our action, into our behavior, into our society itself.
That's a terrifying image. And I know, again, we're not trying to draw comparisons, but there is, at least on an emotional level, it generates feelings and images related to a totalitarian state. I understand that it's not, but emotionally it feels overwhelming.
Well,
in
it
that
feels
way.
totalitarian because it feels like a place of no escape.
Yeah.
And
An
it
overwhelming power and control over our lives.
And it feels like a place of absolutism.
Right.
Because computational truth replaces politics. And humankind is not meant to live in absolutism. Uncertainty is a feature of the human condition. And that's why we invented language, contracts, law, society, as a way of combining together and collaborating together in order to minimize the downside of uncertainty, which is inevitable in the future. And as we do that, building our trust, building our bonds, learning how to work together, learning how to solve problems. This is the social fabric. This is how social trust is created. But then if we imagine a world of computational certainty, we no longer have to do that. We no longer have to work together. We no longer have to debate and contest. We no longer have to collaborate. We no longer have to problem solve. We no longer have to put our shoulders together in the face of uncertainty and make our way to the future together. We just rely on the absolutism of the computational answer. And that becomes a new form of profoundly anti-democratic absolutism.
Also, you touched on this earlier when we were just talking about the distinctions. Totalitarianism uses force and the fear of violence that's generated from the threat of violence to compel people to moderate their behavior. This is something where the behavior is moderated by those who have the power. Instead of it being from the outside in, it's from the inside out.
Well, you're right. The whole essence of totalitarianism is that terror is used to shape behavior. But that's why I think this distinction is so important. Instrumentarian power. It's the instrumentation that is used at an arm's length to shape behavior, and you don't know it. You're not aware of it. You're not afraid of it. You're not terrified. No one is trying to cut your head off or send you to the gulag or the concentration camp. So as I've reiterated a few times now, the surveillance capitalists are very proud of the fact that these systems are designed to bypass awareness. So you never know it's happening, you never know it's coming, and therefore you are robbed of the right of combat. Resistance is annihilated at the root because we don't know that it's happening to us. So it's a slow burn. It's a slow burn. And you go out and walk on the streets outside the studio. Everybody's walking on the sidewalk, looking at their phone. Yeah. It's already in train.
So you kind of hinted at this before, and you've talked about it at length in your book, but societies of human beings are complex systems. And that's because free will is a feature of the system. The economic systems that we have today, you mentioned Hayek in the book, for example. Hayek deals with the information problem. This is what prices are for. It's because we can't perfectly know as human beings what the price of something should be, and so the market manifests that price in a sense. These economic systems that we've developed, they don't seem that they could work in this society, in this type of a system. And I also wonder, and I think you make the point in your book, I wonder also about democracy as a system. In other words, democracy requires free will also. And you point some statistics out in your book about the loss of faith in democracy in Western countries. There's also more and more talk about universal basic income. You make the point about General Motors at the height of the Great Depression employed more people than Google and Facebook at the height of their market capitalizations. I think what's clear from reading your book is that there's no way to actually live under such a system and have these systems of government and economics that we have. You devote a good deal of time in the book, I don't know that we'll get time to talk about it here, about solutions, ways of basically resisting, because you talk about it in terms of resistance. You also talk about outrage and finding our outrage and naming and shaming. And I think there are a lot of positive lessons there. I don't know if you want to comment on any of that before we go, because I know you have to get going, Professor Zuboff.
Well, you've raised so many important points, and I think the big picture here is that I mentioned at the very beginning when we were talking about the definition of surveillance capitalism that there are many ways in which surveillance capitalism seems to diverge quite dramatically from the history of capitalism. One you mentioned, like the whole idea of why do we have to have free markets? Why do we have to have free enterprise? Why all the emphasis on freedom? Going all the way back to Adam Smith. And this is the theme that Friedrich Hayek, the architect of neoliberalism, took up. The whole idea was that we can never know what is going on in the market. It's so complex that it's deeply mysterious, ineffable. And therefore, every actor has to have maximum freedom to do the best they can, to make the best judgments they can, because no one can see the totality. Well, now, in this new regime that we've been discussing, we have a situation where the totality is visible. And yet, surveillance capitalists are still demanding absolute freedom. So here's the great contradiction. What I say in the book is that they know too much to qualify for freedom. That the whole justification for freedom, for the freedom of the market, was that we cannot know.
Well, this is also, you touch on this with the divisions of learning in society, right? This is what you mean by the division of learning in society.
Yes. And so now the fact that they know too much to qualify for freedom, we've entered the 21st century, which is a century in which the key principles of social order are really about the division of learning, not much less so now about the division of labor, right? It's less about what do I do than what do I know? And the key questions for the division of learning in society, who knows? Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides
These
who
are basic
knows?
philosophical questions. Who will guard the guardians?
That's right. Knowledge, authority, and power, the essential questions. So now we're entering the 21st century with these huge institutional creations of surveillance capitalism that have amassed these asymmetries of knowledge, these concentrations of knowledge that really are unprecedented in human history. They know everything about us. We know almost nothing about them. Their
That's
knowledge
a remarkable statement.
is about us, but it's not for us. So these are very peculiar, unprecedented asymmetries. And the knowledge that they have accumulated is not knowledge that they will, and in many cases even can share. Right? Because this is now embedded in these machine systems that create the predictions that drive the markets. So this is what, when Durkheim talked about, the philosopher, sociologist Durkheim, who first wrote about the division of labor in society as the axial principle of the 20th century, he wrote about these things can go haywire, and you can have an abnormal division of labor where elite power takes control of the economic machinery. And things are very unequal in the way they're divided, in the way these opportunities to participate and contribute are divided. Feudal systems, elitist systems. Well, now we're finding ourselves early stages of creating the 21st century society, division of learning in society, already pathologically shaped by these deep asymmetries of knowledge and the deep asymmetries of power that accrues from that knowledge.
Power.
Right? So what this means is that in addition to economic inequality, we're introducing a whole new axis of inequality into 21st century society, which is the inequality of who knows. Who decides who knows? Who decides who decides who knows? The answer to these questions are now lodged in the terrain of the surveillance capitalists. And what I say is that is not okay. That is an intolerable situation. It's a situation that no 21st century citizen should face. And it is now up to us to name this, to grasp it, to call upon, insist upon the resources of our democratic institutions, which have largely slept while surveillance capitalism has flourished, and to insist that democracy retake the high ground. That is democracy that decides the division of learning in society. That is democracy that decides the future. That is democracy that oversees the trajectory of the digital. That is democracy that invites new competitors to take hold of the digital in ways that actually can fulfill its promise of empowerment and emancipation and democratization. Our democracies have to be reinvigorated, resuscitated in order to understand what has happened, intervene, interrupt, outlaw this new economic logic in its very specific mechanisms, so that the way is opened again, where the digital is freed from its enslavement to surveillance capitalism, if you will, from this parasite that has taken hold and hijacked it.
It's interesting. For listeners, in the overtime, I'm going to go through some of these solutions and some of the things that Professor Zuboff outlines in her book, because I also think there are market opportunities. You have a great quote. I think it's from actually an interview you gave. I tweeted it out. I really loved it, having to do with market opportunities, because I completely agree, and I've been making this point myself. I think there's a humongous market opportunity here because of this profound market failure in not addressing the privacy.
This is a market failure of world historic proportions, because nobody wants this.
It's an existential threat to the business models of these enormous platforms. Now, Apple is an interesting case, of course, because they've made a point to differentiate themselves from Google, and I think they're trying to take this competitive advantage, which is to say that we can offer you a platform and give you back your privacy. And by doing that, it's taking a competitive shot at Google.
So we'll see.
We'll see.
I mean, obviously, Apple has taken that stand. Tim Cook has taken that stand, but Apple is still full of many contradictions, many things that would have to be resolved. But were it to be an Apple or a company, alliance of companies, alliance of business leaders who can found a new ecosystem that really plants a flag in the ground, changes the trajectory toward the digital future. This alliance, these new operators, these new competitors have the opportunity to engage every single person on planet Earth as their customer, because nobody wants to be entangled in surveillance capitalism.
Well, I think that's where the optimism comes from. And I'm sure you've seen it because you've been touring now on your book, and you see how many people respond to this.
Yes, that's right.
I think that's what's so optimistic about this. The demand is there, and I think people are waking up because that anxiety is becoming impossible for some of us to ignore.
Absolutely right. I have every faith that we triumph here. Because, and the key thing goes back to our distinction between technology and capitalism, surveillance capitalism specifically. Our societies have successful experience in fighting and tethering the raw excesses of capitalism to the requirements of our populations, of our people, and of our democracies. We ended the Gilded Age. We did it again during the Depression. We did it again in the post-war era. We brought law, regulation, and opened the way for new forms of competition that allowed capitalism to reach an equilibrium with democracy, and we called it market democracy. And I see every possibility today as people all over the world are being activated. And the naming is a key part of that. As people are activated, politicians are being activated. I've just spent a week in Brussels, 10 days in London. I've seen it in Europe. Politicians are being activated. Political leaders are talking about surveillance capitalism. We see folks who have nominally been called users, the name given to them by surveillance capitalists, now beginning to understand we have political interests and we have economic interests, we have social and psychological interests. We want something else. The demand is there. That is going to make its way into the political system, and it's going to make its way into the market system.
Absolutely.
So I have every belief that we know how to create this change, how to take on this kind of combat and do it successfully. We've done it before. We'll do it again. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the story.
I feel 100% the exact same way, and I think it's been validated by many of the conversations that I've had on this program. Dr. Zuboff, I want to thank you so much for coming on the show.
Thank you, Dimitri.
And that was my episode with Shoshana Zuboff. I want to thank Dr. Zuboff for being on my program. Today's episode of Hidden Forces was recorded at Creative Media Design Studios in New York City. For more information about this week's episode, or if you want easy access to related programming, visit our website at hiddenforces.io and subscribe to our free email list. If you want access to overtime segments, episode transcripts, and show rundowns full of links and detailed information related to each and every episode, check out our premium subscription, available through the Hidden Forces website or through our Patreon page. Today's episode was produced by me and edited by Stylianos Nicolaou. For more episodes, you can check out our website at hiddenforces.io. Join the conversation at Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram at Hidden Forces Pod, or send me an email at dk@hiddenforces.io. As always, thanks for listening. We'll see you next week.